The prairie night was still, the kind of silence that swallowed even the coyotes' cries. The only sound came from the gentle pop of wood burning in the small stone fireplace of Jeb Carter's cabin. He had spent the day mending fences and checking cattle, and exhaustion had claimed him early. But just as sleep began to settle heavy on his shoulders, a sharp knock shattered the quiet. It was not the wind rattling the shutters, nor the usual creak of old wood. It was deliberate, urgent, and human. Jeb's eyes flew open. His hand instinctively reached for the revolver resting on the table by his bed. Out here, miles from the nearest town, unexpected visitors in the dead of night rarely meant anything good. He rose slowly, boots pressing against the creaky floorboards. Each step measured. Another knock followed. Lighter this time, but desperate. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide. Still, Jeb's gut tightened. A man who lived alone on the edge of frontier lands learned long ago to expect danger first and mercy later. "Who's there?" he called, voice low and steady. No answer. Just the soft rustle of movement on the other side of the door. Jeb's jaw tightened. He lifted the iron latch with his free hand, revolver cocked in the other, and swung the door open. The sight that greeted him made him blink in disbelief. Standing in the pale glow of the moonlight was not an outlaw or a desperate settler, but a child, a native boy no older than 7 or 8. His dark hair hung in loose strands around his face, his small body wrapped in a worn blanket that dragged against the dirt. His eyes, wide and solemn, stared up at Jeb with a mixture of fear and determination. In his hands, clutched tightly to his chest, was a folded piece of paper. The boy didn't move, didn't speak, only stood there with knuckles white from holding on so fiercely. Jeb lowered the gun, but didn't put it away. "Where'd you come from, boy?" he asked gently, scanning the darkness beyond the cabin. The prairie stretched endless in every direction. No horse, no wagon, no rider in sight. Just this lone child dropped at his doorstep like a ghost from nowhere. The boy's lips trembled. Finally, he whispered, voice fragile but clear, "It's for the man who saved my mother." The words pierced Jeb deeper than any bullet could. His heart gave a hard, unsteady thud. For a moment, he forgot the night, the danger, even the revolver in his hand. 100 memories he had long buried threatened to claw their way back, memories of blood, smoke, and a woman's eyes filled with pain and gratitude. But this boy, this child, how could he possibly know? Jeb crouched low, meeting the boy's gaze. "Son, who's your mother?" he asked, voice softer now. The child didn't answer. He only extended the folded paper toward Jeb as though it were a lifeline. His small fingers shook, but he refused to let go until Jeb reached forward and carefully accepted it. The paper was creased, worn from travel, but sealed with care. "Come inside," Jeb said firmly. He cast one last glance into the night before pulling the boy into the warmth of the cabin and shutting the door tight against the chill. Inside, the firelight painted the room in amber hues. The boy stood near the door, still clutching the blanket. Close, his bare feet dusty and cracked. He refused food when Jeb offered bread, refused water when offered a cup. All he did was watch the cowboy with those wide, unblinking eyes, as if waiting for him to open the letter and understand. Jeb set his revolver aside on the mantel. His rough hands trembled as he turned the folded paper over in the firelight. The handwriting on the outside was neat, familiar in a way that tugged at the edges of his memory. He hadn't seen it in years, yet it made his chest tighten with recognition. The boy shifted on his feet, finally whispering again, "Mama said, give it to the man who saved her." Jeb exhaled slowly, his throat tight. He sank into his chair, by the fire, the letter resting heavy in his palm. He had lived a life of solitude, never asking for thanks, never expecting his past deeds to return to him. Yet here it was, knocking at his door in the form of a child. The night was silent once more, but the weight of that silence had changed. For Jeb knew that whatever words lay inside that letter, they would drag him back to a past he thought long buried, and toward a future he never expected. The fire crackled softly, its warmth filling the small cabin, but the air between the Cowboy and the boy remained heavy with unease. Jeb leaned forward in his chair, the letter still unopened in his hand, while the boy stood rooted near the door, refusing to step further inside. His blanket dragged across the floor, edges frayed, and dirty from travel. His eyes, dark and unyielding, tracked Jeb's every movement. Jeb had seen fear in men before, in outlaws cornered, in ranch hands facing a stampede, in soldiers on the battlefield. But this was different. The boy wasn't trembling with fear, nor was he frozen in shock. His silence wasn't born of terror. It was purposeful, guarded, like he was carrying something far greater than himself, and had been told not to let words slip free unless they were necessary. Jeb set the letter on the table, pushing it slightly aside. He'd open it soon enough, but right now the boy's silence mattered more. "You got a name, son?" Jeb asked gently, resting his elbows on his knees. The boy said nothing, his chin lifted a little, defiant. Jeb sighed, rubbing a calloused hand across his jaw. "Fair enough. Folks sometimes hold their tongues till they're ready. But you're safe here. No one's gonna harm you under this roof." The boy blinked but offered no reply. He only pulled the blanket tighter around himself. Jeb stood and crossed the room slowly, careful not to startle him. He filled a tin cup with warm water from the kettle by the fire and placed it on the table near the boy. "If you're thirsty, it's yours. I won't press you." For a long moment, the boy didn't move. Then, cautious as a fawn stepping into a clearing, he shuffled forward, his small, bare feet whispering against the wooden floor. He reached for the cup, both hands wrapping around it tightly, and took a sip. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, but still not a word left his lips. Jeb studied him quietly. Dust streaked the child's face, but beneath it his features stirred something familiar, the sharp cheekbones, the determined set of his eyes. It unsettled Jeb, tugging at an old memory he had tried hard to bury. The boy finished the water, set the cup down, and retreated back to the safety of the door as if he'd strayed too close. "You came a long way to find me," Jeb said softly. "That letter you brought, it carries weight, I can tell. But I reckon it don't carry everything. There's more in your silence than in any words you might say." The boy shifted, his gaze flickering toward the folded paper resting by the fire. For the first time, his small hand moved from under the blanket to point at it. Then he lowered his arm and said nothing more. Jeb felt the letter burning against his mind, even though he hadn't opened it yet. He could see the boy's loyalty, the way he held his silence like armor. Whoever his mother was, she had trusted this child with a task beyond his years. And that trust, Jeb realized, was sacred. Breaking it too quickly with questions would be wrong. "All right," Jeb said, his voice low, almost resigned. "We'll let the letter do the talking when the time's right." The boy's eyes flickered with the faintest glimmer of relief, though his lips never parted. He curled into a corner near the door, wrapping himself tighter in his blanket. His silence remained, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a vow, one he had been trained to keep. Jeb stoked the fire, letting sparks dance up the chimney. He glanced at the boy, his mind whirling with questions he dared not ask. Who was this child? Why him? And why now, after all these years of solitude? The boy shifted again, resting his head against the wall. Sleep tugged at his small body, his eyelids heavy. But still he did not speak. His silence carried into his dreams, and even then, Jeb sensed, He would not betray the trust placed in him. Jeb leaned back in his chair, the unopened letter glowing in the firelight. Outside, the prairie winds swept across the darkened land, carrying whispers of a past that had found its way back to him. The boy's silence had not answered anything, but it had spoken louder than words, telling Jeb that the letter he held was only the beginning, and that the truth, waiting inside, would change both their lives forever. The letter sat on the table like a brand, its edges curling slightly in the fire's warmth. Jeb stared at it for a long while, arms crossed over his chest, boots planted firm on the wooden floor. The boy had finally drifted into sleep in the corner, blanket wrapped around him like a cocoon, his breathing slow and steady. But Jeb's own chest carried no such ease. He had spent years burying his past, building fences, tending cattle, and convincing himself that what had happened long ago was gone with the smoke, yet here it was, returned to him in the fragile hands of a child. He reached out at last and slid the letter closer. The paper was worn but carefully folded, its creases straight, as if the boy's mother had prepared it many times before pressing it into her son's hand. The writing on the outside was not much, just his name. Jeb Carter. Nothing more. The sight of his own name in her handwriting made his stomach knot. It was neat, deliberate, the hand of someone who had practiced their letters with discipline. He remembered faintly the sound of her voice, accented but steady, and the way her eyes had met his once, filled with both terror and courage. Jeb hesitated, thumb resting on the seal. Opening this meant facing ghosts. It meant opening wounds he had stitched shut with years of silence. But the boy's words echoed in his mind. For the man who saved my mother. With a sharp breath, Jeb broke the seal. The crack of the paper seemed to echo in the quiet cabin. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with his rough hands. The words inside were written in the same steady hand. Jeb Carter, you may not remember me, but I have never forgotten you. Many winters ago, when men came with fire and guns, you stood between me and death. You did not know my name, nor did I know yours. But you saved me when I had no strength left. I carried your face in my heart from that day on. Jeb's throat tightened. He remembered all too well the raid on the edge of the river, the settlers' fire-consuming huts, the cries of children. He had acted without thinking, dragging a young woman from the path of a rifle shot, shielding her until the worst had passed. He had left her there, certain she would be safer without him, certain their paths would never cross again. The letter went on. I write to you now because my people face another storm. The same men, or men like them, return with greed in their eyes. They want our land. They will not stop. I cannot leave my people, but my son is small, and he needed to find you. I told him of the man who saved me. I told him if ever we were in need, he must seek you. And he has. His name is Ahiv. He is strong, though young, and he has traveled far. Please, Jeb, I ask you once more to stand between death and us, not for me alone, but for all who call this land home. The words blurred for a moment as Jeb blinked hard, his chest heavy. He set the paper down, leaning back in his chair, staring at the fire. His calloused hand pressed against his mouth as if to hold back the flood of memory. So her name remained unspoken, even in writing. No signature, no farewell beyond the plea. Only trust. Trust that he, a cowboy who had vanished into solitude, would answer a call he never expected. Jeb looked to the corner where the boy, Ahiv, slept curled against the wall. The blanket rose and fell with each steady breath. His face was peaceful now, but Jeb saw the fatigue etched into the child's small frame. He had crossed miles of dangerous land with nothing but a letter and faith in a stranger. The fire cracked, sparks leaping, pulling Jeb's thoughts back to the present. He folded the letter carefully, his hands no longer trembling. He felt the weight of it settle into him, heavier than any saddle or pack he had ever carried. There was no denying it. The letter had bound him once again to a cause larger than himself. Jeb whispered to the empty room, "Why now? After all, these years." His voice caught, and he looked back at the sleeping boy. Because she never forgot. The silence stretched, filled only by the night wind outside and the low moan of the cabin's timbers. Jeb knew sleep would not come for him tonight. He sat in his chair, the letter resting in his hand, staring into the flames as they danced. The past had found him, and with it came a choice. For the first time in years, Jeb Carter felt the stirrings of the man he once was, the man who had stood in fire and smoke, shielding another with his own life. And though he did not yet know what tomorrow would demand, he knew the answer to her letter had already been written in his heart. The fire had burned low, nothing left but embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Jeb sat motionless in his chair, the letter resting in his hand like a stone. He could hear the boy's soft breathing from the corner, steady and unbroken. But inside Jeb, nothing was steady. The words of the letter repeated themselves in his mind until they became a rhythm. "You stood between me and death. I told him of the man who saved me. Please, Jeb, I ask you once more." He shut his eyes, but the darkness behind them only deepened the memories. He was back there, years ago, on the banks of the river where the cottonwoods bent low. The air had been thick with smoke. Screams cut through the night like blades, and the hiss of flames devoured the huts that lined the clearing. Men with torches moved like shadows, their rifles firing at anything that moved. Settlers, drunk on hatred and greed, had descended on the tribe with fire and fury. Jeb hadn't gone there to fight. He had been younger then, drifting from place to place, looking for work, for something to fill the emptiness inside him. He had stumbled into that chaos by chance, and yet, once he saw what was happening, he couldn't turn away. He remembered the moment with painful clarity. The young woman stumbling through the smoke, clutching a child too small to walk, a settler's rifle leveled at her, finger tightening on the trigger. Without thought, Jeb had thrown himself forward, knocking her and the child to the ground just as the shot cracked through the air. The bullet struck the dirt where she had stood. They had looked at each other only once, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief, his filled with a reckless determination he didn't know he possessed. He had shielded her as best he could until the chaos passed, then left before dawn. He never asked her name. He never sought her again. And now, all these years later, her son slept under his roof. Jeb rubbed his temples with both hands, the weight of it pressing down hard. He had spent years trying to forget that night, not because he was ashamed of what he had done, but because remembering meant feeling again, and feeling had no place in the life he chose. A cowboy alone on the range had no use for ghosts of the past, but the letter had torn open the old wound, and with it came questions that gnawed at him. Why had she waited all these years? What dangers pressed her now that she would send her boy into the wilderness with nothing but a message? And why him? Surely she had others, her people, her kin. Why ask for Jeb Carter? His gaze drifted to the boy. Even in sleep, Ahiv's small hands clutched at the blanket, as if holding on to something fragile. The child had traveled through unknown dangers, walked into the arms of a stranger, and yet carried himself with a kind of quiet strength. There was something in his features, a familiarity that Jeb could not shake. The boy's cheekbones, the line of his jaw, even the set of his eyes. They stirred something in Jeb's chest he dared not name. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the cabin. The floorboards creaked under his boots. He had spent years, carving out a life of solitude, convincing himself that his past was behind him. He tended cattle, fixed fences, lived off the land, and spoke to no one unless he had to. But now, the walls of that solitude felt like a cage closing in. He stopped, at the window, staring out at the moonlit prairie. The land stretched wide and endless, but for the first time in years he felt trapped, not by fences or borders, but by memory. The weight of what he had done and what he had left undone pressed hard against his chest. Jeb rested a hand on the windowsill, knuckles white. The letter's plea had awakened something he thought was long dead: responsibility. He wasn't a man who owed debts to anyone, but he could not shake the truth. That woman had trusted him once, and now she trusted him again, enough to send her son across dangerous country. Turning back toward the boy, Jeb whispered to himself, "She believes I'm still that man." The words tasted bitter, for he wasn't sure he was. He was older now, wearier, worn down by years of solitude and silence. But as he watched Ahiv stir in his sleep, pulling the blanket tighter, Jeb realized that whether or not he was that man, he would have to become him again. The weight of memory was not something he could put aside anymore. It demanded an answer. And Jeb Carter, though he didn't yet know how, understood that the choice had already been made. The fire had dwindled to a low glow, and the cabin was cloaked in the quiet hum of night. Jeb sat at the table, the letter still open before him, its words etched in his mind. Outside, the prairie stretched under the pale moon, untouched and serene. But inside, the weight of the message pressed like stones in his chest. He had read the letter once, twice, even thrice, yet the urgency never faded. It was more than a note of gratitude. It was a plea. The woman, whose name he still did not know, was asking him to act once more, to stand in the line of danger she could not face herself. And she had chosen her son to deliver the message, trusting him to navigate the perilous journey and reach Jeb's door. Jeb's eyes shifted to Ahiv, sleeping quietly in the corner. The boy's small chest rose and fell with each breath, his hands curled around the frayed blanket. He had traveled far, braving unknown terrain, and carried this plea, like a torch through darkness. The courage it took for a child to do such a thing was staggering. Jeb leaned back in his chair, letting the leather creak beneath him. He could not ignore the truth. The danger was real, and it was close. The woman's people were threatened by men who sought to take their land, men who would stop at nothing to ensure their control. Greed and violence had returned, and her only recourse was to reach him. He imagined her there, standing among her people, eyes scanning the horizon, heart heavy with fear. She had no choice but to send Ahiv, trusting that he would find him and that he would act. Jeb had acted once before, without thought, without hesitation, and now, decades later, the same call came again, this time wrapped in the fragile hope of a child's hand. Jeb ran a rough hand across his face. He was tired. He had lived a quiet life, tending to his land, to his cattle, to himself. Danger, conflict, bloodshed. He had buried them all. He had thought the past would stay buried with it. Yet here it was, pressing him into action once more. He looked again at Ahiv, still asleep, trusting him implicitly. There was no hesitation in the boy's journey, only faith. Faith in Jeb, in a man who had saved his mother years ago, faith that he would answer the call. That trust was not something Jeb could ignore. "I can't do this alone," he muttered under his breath. The thought of venturing out, facing unknown men with ill intent, weighed heavily. But then he thought of the boy, the woman, the people, counting on him, and the words of the letter echoed again, clear as day. "Please, Jeb, I ask you once more to stand between death and us." The plea was simple yet powerful. Not for himself, not for glory or reward, but for others, strangers whose lives were intertwined with his by a single act of courage years ago. That act had left a mark, invisible but unbroken, reaching through time. Jeb's eyes met Ahiv's small, peaceful face, and the decision solidified in his chest like iron forging in fire. He would not let this child face danger alone. He would not ignore a plea that bore the weight of life, loyalty, and unspoken bonds. The cowboy rose from his chair, the letter now folded carefully and tucked into his coat pocket. He moved toward the corner where the boy slept, kneeling to gently shake him awake. "It's time to get ready," Jeb said softly, careful not to startle him. "We've got a journey ahead, and there's work to do." Ahiv stirred, eyes blinking open, hesitant but trusting. He nodded slightly, as if he already knew what was expected, as if the path had been set long before they ever met. He did not ask questions. He did not complain. His silence, his faith, carried more weight than any words could convey. Jeb straightened, feeling the resolve settle in him. The firelight flickered across the walls, casting long shadows, but he felt a lightness in knowing that action was necessary and that he would face it with purpose. Tonight the plea had been heard. Tomorrow the journey would begin, and Jeb Carter, though weary and cautious, would once again stand between danger and the lives of those who trusted him, as he had done once before, and as fate had now demanded he do again. Outside, the prairie lay still and silent, but within the cabin, the quiet held the promise of movement, of courage, and of a bond forged in trust, unbroken by time or distance. The first light of dawn filtered through the cabin's small window, painting the room in muted gold. Jeb Carter sat on the edge of his bed, boots unlaced and hat resting in his lap, staring at the horizon that stretched wide and endless beyond the prairie. The fire had long since died, leaving only smoldering ashes that reminded him how fleeting warmth could be. Ahiv, the small boy who had traveled so far to find him, was already awake, stretching and rubbing his eyes. The blanket hung loosely over his shoulders, a small shield against the chill that lingered in the early morning. He looked at Jeb expectantly, though he said nothing. His silence had always been his strength, carrying the weight of the letter and its plea without complaint. Jeb exhaled slowly, trying to sort the storm of thoughts that swirled in his mind. The woman's message had been clear. Danger pressed her people, and they could not fight it alone. But Jeb had spent years avoiding conflict, living a quiet life among his cattle and fences. He had avoided the world of men who sought power and destruction because it always came at too great a cost. He had chosen solitude, not cowardice, and it had served him well. And yet here he was, faced with a choice he could not easily ignore. He thought of the boy, of the journey that lay ahead. The wilderness could be treacherous, filled with men whose motives were ruthless and unpredictable. There were rivers to cross, mountains to traverse, and strangers whose intentions could mean the difference between life and death. Could he, a man grown older and wearier, face these dangers again? Could he lead a child through peril, knowing the burden was heavy on both of them? Jeb's hand drifted to the revolver resting on the table, then hesitated. Weapons were only part of the answer. Wisdom, cunning, and a careful mind would be just as crucial. But the boy's presence complicated everything. Ahiv was not only the messenger but a symbol of trust, innocence, and hope. To fail him would be to fail the woman, the tribe, and the debt Jeb owed to the past. He rose and began pacing, boots creaking against the worn floorboards. The horizon beyond the cabin shimmered with promise and threat alike. Every instinct in his body screamed caution. Every fiber of his being told him that stepping into the unknown was dangerous. Yet another voice, quieter but more insistent, whispered of duty, of courage not for glory but because it was the right thing to do. Jeb stopped at the window and studied the prairie. It stretched for miles, vast and untamed. Here, he had spent years building a life of simplicity, a life free from interference, free from obligation beyond himself. The thought of leaving it, even for something he could not fully understand, made him hesitate. Yet he could not ignore the small boy who had come so far, nor the plea that had traveled through years to reach him. Turning back, he studied Ahiv carefully. The boy's eyes were open, steady, waiting without expectation, yet full of quiet determination. He had made the journey willingly, without fear or complaint, and he trusted Jeb completely. That trust, fragile and sacred, demanded a response. Jeb's mind wandered to the letter again, the words of the woman echoing in his thoughts. "Please, Jeb, I ask you once more to stand between death and us." The weight of those words pressed upon him like an anvil. She had asked once before, and he had answered. And now she asked again, and the answer lay before him, heavy with consequence. He sank into his chair, elbows resting on his knees. Every fiber of his body urged him to stay, to live quietly and avoid the chaos. But as he looked at Ahiv, so small, so determined, the cowardice argument weakened. He realized that the life he had built in solitude was no longer sufficient. The past had returned, demanding not only his courage, but his presence, his skill, and his loyalty. After a long moment, Jeb straightened, jaw firm, eyes meeting Ahiv's with resolve. "All right, boy," he said, voice steady. "We'll do this. But you need to know it won't be easy. There'll be rivers and fire and men who won't think twice about harming us." Ahiv nodded, the barest hint of a smile crossing his lips. He seemed to understand the gravity without needing more explanation. Jeb reached for his hat and boots, preparing for the journey. He felt the weight of decision lift slightly, replaced by the burden of action. This was no longer a question of whether he could face the danger. It was whether he would rise to it, as he had done long ago, and protect those who could not protect themselves. Outside, the prairie was waking with the first light of dawn, golden and infinite. Inside, a cowboy and a boy, connected by trust and destiny, were readying themselves for a path neither could fully predict. And in that moment, the dilemma dissolved, replaced by a resolve stronger than fear. The cabin was alive with quiet urgency as Jeb Carter moved with deliberate care, preparing for a journey that would stretch them both to their limits. The first light of morning illuminated the dust motes in the air, revealing the simplicity of his life: rough-hewn furniture, shelves lined with canned goods, and the tools of a man who lived off the land. Today, however, those tools would serve a purpose far beyond tending cattle or repairing fences. Jeb moved to the corner where Ahiv had awakened, brushing the small boy's blanket aside. "We need to get your gear together," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Water, food, rope, blankets. You're going to carry some of it too." Ahiv nodded silently, already accustomed to following without question. He had been trained for endurance, but the journey ahead was unlike anything he had faced before. Still, he displayed no fear, only a quiet focus that both impressed and unsettled Jeb. The boy was more capable than his years suggested, yet fragile enough that any misstep could be disastrous. Jeb moved methodically, laying supplies across the floor. He checked his rifle, ensuring it was clean and ready, then secured his revolver and hunting knife. He packed dried meat, water skins, a flint for fire, and a few blankets. Then he turned to Ahiv, handing him a small pack filled with provisions. The boy accepted it with a nod, adjusting the straps across his narrow shoulders. "You'll need to pace yourself," Jeb cautioned. "It's a long ride, and the trails can be unforgiving. No running ahead, no wandering off. Stick close and trust me to watch over you." Ahiv didn't reply with words, only glanced up with eyes that held understanding far beyond his age. That glance told Jeb everything he needed to know. The boy had faith, and that faith was now part of the burden Jeb carried. Outside, the prairie was bathed in golden light. Horses stamped their hooves, flicking tails as they awaited the day's work. Jeb saddled his own mount, a sturdy bay named Dust, and adjusted the reins, making sure the saddle was secure. He checked the packs strapped to the horse's side, ensuring nothing was loose or likely to fall during the journey. Ahiv's horse was smaller, nimble but strong, its dark coat shining in the morning sun. Jeb helped the boy mount, adjusting the stirrups and cinching the saddle tight. The boy swung into the saddle with practiced ease, revealing a surprising familiarity with horses that told Jeb he had spent time learning the ways of travel and survival. "Ready?" Jeb asked, stepping back. Ahiv nodded once. Jeb mounted Dust, feeling the familiar rhythm of the horse beneath him. The wind carried a chill, sharp with the promise of early morning, yet exhilarating in its clarity. The prairie stretched. Before them, vast and untamed, hiding dangers in its golden waves of grass and shadowed hollows. Before leaving, Jeb double-checked the supplies. Flint and fire-starting materials, food and water, maps of the terrain, and a carefully folded copy of the letter tucked safely inside his coat. The message was their compass, a guide to the task, ahead and a reminder of the stakes, the lives of a woman, her people, and the boy now entrusted to him. He glanced at Ahiv again. The boy's expression was calm but alert, scanning the horizon as though measuring every possible threat. Jeb felt a surge of respect and responsibility like never before. Every step he took would carry not only his own fate, but that of the child who had braved miles of wilderness to find him. "Keep your eyes open," Jeb said quietly, touching the horse's flank. "There's danger out there we can't always see, and we'll need every bit of caution. But together, we'll get through it." The boy gave a faint nod, and with that, they moved forward. Dust's hooves thudded against the dirt path, steady and sure, while the smaller horse followed in rhythm. The prairie seemed endless, a canvas of golden waves under a sky streaked with pink and orange. Each gust of wind whispered of the challenges. Ahead, of rivers to cross, mountains to climb, and men whose intentions were unknown but likely hostile. Jeb adjusted his grip on the reins, feeling the weight of his responsibility settle firmly in his shoulders. The path would be dangerous, yes, but it was not one they could avoid. The woman's plea, carried so courageously by the boy, demanded action. It demanded courage, skill, and endurance, all qualities Jeb had cultivated over years of solitary life. As they rode into the heart of the prairie, a quiet determination grew between them. Jeb and Ahiv were no longer just cowboy and boy. They were partners bound by trust, united in a mission that would test every ounce of their strength. And with each step forward, the journey began in earnest, carrying the weight of the past and the promise of hope into the unknown. The prairie stretched endlessly, golden and serene under the morning sun. But Jeb Carter knew appearances were deceiving. Every mile carried potential peril, treacherous terrain, hidden animals, and men whose greed and cruelty could strike without warning. Dust's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the hard-packed dirt, and the smaller horse beside him kept pace with surprising steadiness, guided by Ahiv's small, confident hands. The first trial came sooner than expected. A narrow river cut across their path, the water swift and cold. Jeb dismounted, examining the crossing carefully. "It's deeper than it looks, and the current's strong," he said, eyeing the foamy water. "We'll need to go slow." Ahiv glanced nervously but nodded. With steady hands, Jeb led Dust into the river, testing each step. The boy followed, holding the reins of his horse with careful determination. The current tugged at them, cold, water splashing high, but Jeb's steady guidance and the boy's trust in him kept both horses balanced. Halfway across, a sudden surge swept toward them. Dust balked, hooves slipping on the slick stones. Jeb's arm shot out to steady the boy's mount, gripping the reins with every ounce of strength. For a tense moment, it felt as though the river might claim them both, but careful coordination and sheer willpower carried them safely to the opposite bank. Shivering and soaked, Ahiv dismounted, brushing water from his horse's coat. "We made it," he whispered, voice low but triumphant. Jeb gave a brief nod, recognizing the courage it had taken for a child to endure such a crossing. The next trial came in the form of weather. Clouds rolled across the sky like dark banners, and soon rain fell in sheets, drenching them to the bone. The paths turned to mud, the ground slick and treacherous. Visibility dropped, making every step dangerous. Jeb tightened his grip on Dust's reins, squinting through the downpour to ensure the boy stayed close. Lightning flashed, followed by a low rumble of thunder that shook the prairie. Ahiv flinched, but remained resolute, staying close to Jeb's side. They found a temporary shelter beneath a fallen tree, the rough bark shielding them from the worst of the rain. Wet and cold, they huddled together, sharing warmth and quiet reassurance. But danger was not limited to weather and terrain. As the afternoon waned, the distant sound of shouting carried across the fields. Men were approaching, armed, careless, and hostile. Jeb signaled Ahiv to stay low, moving quietly through tall grass, keeping their horses calm. Every sense was heightened. The slightest misstep could give away their position. The group of men passed dangerously close, unaware of the pair hiding just beyond sight. Jeb's heart pounded in his chest, muscles tensed for action, but he did not speak, for fear that even a whisper would betray them. When the men finally disappeared over the horizon, Ahiv exhaled slowly, eyes wide with relief. Jeb patted the boy's shoulder, silently acknowledging the courage it had taken to remain calm under such threat. The day pressed on, each hour presenting a new challenge. Narrow ridges that tested balance, thick forests where paths vanished beneath undergrowth, and the constant uncertainty of who or what might be watching. The boys' endurance was remarkable, but Jeb knew they could not afford mistakes. One wrong step, one moment of hesitation, and disaster could strike. By evening, they reached a ridge overlooking the distant valley that would be their camp for the night. Dust and the boy's horse were weary, their hooves sore from the day's trials. Jeb dismounted, stretching his legs and surveying the land. The valley below offered shelter and a small stream, but it also demanded caution. The terrain could hide threats, human or animal. As they settled near the stream, preparing a small fire for warmth, Jeb looked at Ahiv. "We've faced a lot today, and tomorrow will bring more," he said quietly. The boy nodded, eyes reflecting both fatigue and determination. "But together," Jeb continued, "we'll get through it. You've got courage, more than I expected, and I won't let you face this alone." Ahiv managed the faintest smile, the first real expression since their journey began. It was small, but it carried weight, a reminder that even through fear and trials, hope could persist. And for Jeb, it was a reaffirmation that the responsibility he had accepted, the pledge to protect and guide this child, was not a burden, but a purpose. Night fell over the valley, wrapping the prairie in darkness. The fire crackled, and the sound of water from the stream mingled with the gentle hum of wind through the grass. Jeb sat close to the boy, alert even as they rested, knowing that tomorrow would demand more strength, more courage, and more trust. But for now, they had survived the day, and that was a victory enough. The valley lay quiet under the pale light of dawn, the first hint of sun brushing the horizon with gold. Jeb Carter stirred near the fire, careful not to wake Ahiv, who had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep after the trials of the day. Yet, Jeb's mind was wide awake, replaying the letter, the boy's journey, and the past he had tried to bury. Today, he knew, would bring answers long delayed, truths hidden by time and silence. They broke camp quietly, the horses trudging, through dew-soaked grass as they prepared to continue. Jeb led the way, map and letter tucked safely inside his coat, while Ahiv followed closely, silent but vigilant. The trail led them through a narrow gorge, the walls of rock rising sharply on either side, shadows hiding the sun's warmth. It was here that the truth began to unfold. A distant figure appeared ahead, moving deliberately toward them. At first, Jeb thought it was another traveler or a threat, but as the figure drew closer, his heart tightened. The woman, the one whose life he had saved years ago, stood there, not a shadow or memory, but flesh and blood, eyes blazing with recognition and relief. She looked older, of course, tempered by years of struggle and hardship, yet her presence carried the same strength and resolve that Jeb remembered from the day he had shielded her from harm. Behind her, members of her tribe emerged cautiously, weapons in hand but eyes hopeful, as if the mere presence of Jeb guaranteed safety. "Jeb Carter," she said, her voice carrying across the rocks, calm but charged with emotion. "You came." Jeb approached slowly, aware of the weight of the moment. "I did," he replied, voice steady but low. "Your son found me. That was no small journey." Ahiv stirred, nudged forward by the woman, and stepped from behind Jeb's horse. The boy's eyes were wide as he recognized his mother, and relief, mixed with pride in his expression. The woman knelt, embracing Ahiv with gentle urgency. Tears ran down her face, but she straightened, looking at Jeb with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "You saved me once, Jeb. I never forgot. I have lived all these years knowing that you were the man who stood between death and me." Her gaze hardened slightly, scanning the horizon as if she could see the danger still lurking. "And now, my people need you again." Jeb listened, the weight of the letter, the boy's journey, and the perilous road behind them converging into clarity. He finally understood the full extent of the plea. The danger was not just for her, not just for Ahiv, but for the tribe, the land, and the lives entwined with them. The men threatening them were relentless, greedy, and violent. Their actions would not cease unless met with courage and skill. Ahiv stepped closer, holding Jeb's hand briefly, a silent acknowledgement of trust and bond. Jeb felt the truth settle over him, that this child, this woman, and her people were connected to him in ways he could never have anticipated. His act years ago had created a ripple, one that had endured, carried forward by faith and gratitude. The woman extended her hand, placing a small, intricately carved medallion into Jeb's palm. "This is for you," she said. "It belongs to my family, and now it belongs to you. It is a symbol of our trust, of the debt owed, and of the hope that you will protect us once more." Jeb held the medallion, feeling its weight. It was more than a token. It was a tangible connection to the past, a bridge between memory and action. He looked at the woman, at Ahiv, and finally allowed a slow exhale of resolve. The truth was clear. He had been called back, not by coincidence, but by consequence, loyalty, and trust. The tribe members began to relax, sensing the tension dissolve. Jeb felt their eyes on him, measuring his courage, weighing his past deeds against the promise of protection. He understood their hope, their fear, and their reliance on him, and he accepted it, not lightly, but with the determination of a man who had long avoided the world but could no longer turn away. "Then we move together," Jeb said, voice firm, eyes scanning the terrain ahead. "We protect what needs protection. We face whatever comes. Together." The woman nodded, Ahiv's hand gripping her own tightly, and the tribe gathered closer, forming a small but determined group. Jeb adjusted his coat, feeling the medallion against his chest, a constant reminder of the trust placed in him. As they stepped forward along the trail, the sun fully rose over the valley, illuminating the path ahead. The journey was far from over, but the truth had been revealed. Courage demanded action, loyalty demanded trust, and past deeds had consequences that stretched far into the present. Jeb Carter, once a solitary cowboy, was no longer alone. He had a purpose, a family of faith, and a mission that he could not abandon. The wind swept across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of challenges, but also the certainty that together they could face whatever lay ahead. The sun was high over the valley, its warm light cutting through the morning haze as Jeb Carter and the small group moved with purpose. The road had been long and treacherous, filled with rivers to cross, ridges to navigate, and threats both seen and unseen. But now, with the woman, her tribe, and Ahif at his side, Jeb felt the culmination of the journey, the destiny that had begun decades ago with a single act of courage. The enemy had been gathering for weeks, encroaching on the tribe's lands with the certainty of men driven by greed. Reports had reached Jeb through the careful observations of scouts, and he had strategized in the nights past, preparing both himself and the tribe for confrontation. This was not a battle of brute strength alone, it was a test of wit, trust, and courage. Jeb surveyed the encampment below. The men of the tribe moved with quiet determination, their movements coordinated and disciplined. Ahiv stood at the edge, eyes sharp, as if sensing the tension in the air. Jeb placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. Stay close. Watch. Learn. This is as much about knowing how to survive as it is about winning. The first confrontation came at midday. Scouts reported the enemy advancing along the ridge to the north. Jeb had prepared a small ambush using natural cover and careful positioning. As the hostile men crested the ridge, Jeb and the tribe rose from their concealed positions, arrows and rifles ready, flanking the intruders with precision. The battle was swift but intense. Jeb moved with the skill of a man who had faced danger before, his revolver accurate, his instincts sharp. Ahiv watched from a safe position, learning the subtleties of survival, the courage needed not to act recklessly but decisively. The enemy, caught off guard by the strategy and unity of the tribe, faltered. They were driven back, their greed no match for careful preparation, knowledge of terrain, and the resolve of those defending their home. When the dust settled, the prairie lay quiet once more and the tribe gathered, victorious but cautious. Jeb surveyed the scene, noting the careful treatment of the wounded, the measured celebration. Victory had been achieved not through bloodlust, but through unity, courage, and intelligence. Ahiv ran forward to his mother, wrapping her in a tight embrace. Tears streaked her face, but there was relief, hope, and pride shining through. Jeb watched, feeling the satisfaction of a mission fulfilled, but also the quiet weight of responsibility lifted. The bond between the cowboy and the child had grown stronger, tempered by shared hardship and mutual trust. The woman approached Jeb, placing the small medallion back in his hands. "You've kept your promise," she said softly. "You've protected us as you once did. Not just me, but my people. The debt has been repaid. Not in gold, not in words, but in courage and loyalty. Thank you." Jeb took a deep breath, the wind carrying the scent of grass and earth. "I didn't do it for thanks," he replied. "I did it because it was right. Because I couldn't let you face it alone." For the first time in years, Jeb felt a sense of completion. The past, long a shadow over his life, had found resolution. The child who had braved the journey, the woman who had trusted him, and the tribe whose survival depended on courage, all had reminded him of the man he once was, and the man he still could be. Ahif tugged gently at Jeb's sleeve. Will you stay? The boy asked, eyes wide, hope shining through fatigue. Jeb looked across the valley, at the faces of people who had become a family through trust and shared struggle. He realized that solitude, once his shield, was no longer necessary. Bonds of loyalty, courage, and protection had been forged, stronger than any fence or frontier. "I think," Jeb said slowly, a rare smile crossing his face, "I think I'll stay for a while." The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the prairie, and the firelight of their camp flickered to life, welcoming the evening. Laughter and quiet conversation began to fill the space, a sound of healing and renewal. The tribe had survived, the danger had been repelled, and a sense of hope blossomed in the hearts of those who had endured. Jeb Carter, once a solitary cowboy, now stood as a protector, a mentor, and a friend. His journey, which had begun with a single act of bravery years ago, had come full circle, intertwining the lives of those he had saved, the child who had found him, and the woman whose trust had never wavered. Destiny had been fulfilled not in grand gestures or wealth, but in the courage to act, the wisdom to guide, and the loyalty to protect. The prairie, vast and endless, stretched out before them, a symbol of freedom, resilience, and the enduring power of human connection.